So this video is going to be a little, maybe discombobulated. It's going to be a little weird. It's kind of a follow-up in a way to the last video where I got some weird things with an i3 and an RX 5600. The intent of that video was to test some affordable GPUs with the Core i3 10105F. Yeah, that one. Anyway, the intent of that video was to test a couple of what are now becoming affordable GPUs with that 4-core 8-thread Intel. But it got weird. So today we're going to pick back up where we started and test a couple of GPUs against each other. Okay, so we're kind of continuing with our experiment that we started and then made a different video out of last week because we found out that the Intel i5 4670 actually did better in some cases than the i3 given the same GPU. The GPU we used was an RX 560, 4 gig, and I got some weird, you would figure, okay, the GPU is going to give it all it's got, it's going to give as much performance as it can, and you're not going to get any more out of it. But that wasn't quite the case with a couple of games. Some games we actually had the older Intel CPU doing much better than the newer Intel CPU, which we found out the Intel, that i3 is a really, I mean, it's a good processor. It's 4 cores, 8 threads compared to the 4-core, 4-thread 4670. But it was a little bit puzzling. We're going to deal with that some more. We're going to go ahead and put some more memory and test that with a different GPU to find out if that processor itself is actually better than the i3 or how it compares with the i3. So that's going to be a video that's upcoming not too long from now, so stay tuned for that. But getting back to this one, we were wanting to test some affordable GPUs. Now, we've got one that's in about the $130 to $150 price range. One that you can get for between $250 and say, $325 or so. And then we've got one, even though I don't have the exact GPU, we're going to make some allowances for it. And we're going to compare that to the $430 to $470 price range. Now, keep in mind, these prices are coming down. So you might not, the one that for $120 to $150 probably not going to come down that much, but the other ones might still be sliding a little bit. We're going to look at the RX 560 because we started that before. We're also going to look at the GTX 1660. This is a 6 gig. It's a very solid board. This happens to be like 2 3/4 inches wide. It's a smaller board. It'll fit in like a mini ITX case. About the same length as the RX 560. It does take a power connection, and it is a pretty stout board. It compares pretty well. It does a pretty good job. And then finally, the one I have is an RX 6600 XT. This happens to be an ASRock board. I don't have an RX 6600. The 6600 XT sells for about $700, $680 to $700. But I'm going to show you the actual numbers on this, and we'll have to kind of make allowances figuring that is about 10 to 15% better in performance than the base model RX 6600. The reason why I tell you this is the RX 6600 and the RTX 3050 are very similar performance. Obviously, the RTX 3050 has some other things that the 6600 doesn't. But the 1660 kind of holds its own, especially when we're matching it with that 4-core, 8-thread i3 processor. Again, that processor we're looking at is the 10105F from Intel. I tested all of these with brand new drivers. I used DDU, which is the download driver uninstaller, I believe it is, or something like that. I don't remember what it's called, but you can look for it. It's DDU, and it gives you a fresh install and takes all the drivers and everything completely out of your system so you can put the next item in. They recommend doing it in safe mode. You can do it without being in safe mode, but that's okay. The main thing here is that all fresh drivers on all this stuff. So I started out, this is where the things got a little bit weird because when I was comparing the RX 560, I noticed that some of my numbers matched up weird with the Intel i5 4670, which they shouldn't have. I'm testing all this on that i3. We'll do some other testing with that other one later, but I tested all this stuff on that i3 10105F. So the first thing we do is we're going to check Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This is about what you expect. The two better cards do much better in this case. And the reason why I mention that is because you see, if you are allowing for 10 to 15% better performance from the AMD product, that does bring it back down more in the range of the GTX 1660. which in this case is about $120 to $140 cheaper than the current RX 6600. I also mentioned that because if you're looking at trying to pay $150 for an RX 560, you can do much better by just a little bit more money in your budget if you can afford it. You don't necessarily have to have that extra, whatever the case is. Maybe it is a case. You might be able to budget somewhere to squeeze just that little bit more out or save up just that little bit extra money to be able to spend $250, $260, $270 to get one of these cards. Obviously, it's not an advertisement for anyone. I'm testing NVIDIA cards and I'm testing AMD cards. I don't have a preference. That's a lie. I do have a preference, but I'm not going to tell you which it is because it has no bearing on this. Anyway, so if we're looking at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you can see we're getting a solid 80 plus frames per second on either one of the top end in this budget, and you're going to be pretty well satisfied. Now, if you're using the RX 560, you can see that it's less than half as much, and you have to ask yourself, is that extra money worth it in the long run? The reason why you might go with a higher end GPU, even though it's not going to net you a whole lot extra in frames, is that maybe that CPU is going to be something you upgrade later. So maybe you're budgeting on the GPU higher and your CPU lower because CPUs are much easier to get. Now, if we go back and look at Borderlands 3, this is where you start to see where the CPU itself is starting to be limited, especially in 1080p low. The 6600 XT and the 1660 both gave us the same amount of frames, 111 frames, and the experience in both was really, really smooth. So, again, we're talking about you're spending more money and not getting a lot more out of it. What does make a difference is when you're looking at that 10 to 15% at 1080p high. You are going to get a little bit better frames per second or what have you on 1080p high with what would be an RX 6600, but for you're still right at matching or almost right at that 60 frames per second on 1080p high with the middle option for us, and so it's not a bad way to go at all. You turn the settings down just a little bit, you're playing great. You're playing almost 90 frames per second on medium, which is, that's pretty darn good. Far Cry 5, we see much the same. We're seeing now that the CPU is starting to get limited a little bit. It doesn't matter how much better your GPU or your graphics solution is going to be, that your CPU is what's going to start holding you back. Again, you can go with the extreme budget option and try to get a GPU later, but like we mentioned, it might be better to try to get just a little bit better GPU and upgrade the CPU, which will be easier to get later. These are almost the same, and if you account for that, say 10 to 15% difference in the RX 6600 and the XT model, then the RX 6600 and the 1660 are really, really close to each other. Forza Horizon 4, we're looking similar. We're talking about you're getting some, again, diminishing returns, but a solid performance by the upper two cards. Again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but you're going to find as you get up in some of these games, you're going to start seeing a little bit of CPU limitation instead of GPU. Take in mind, once again, that these blue numbers, or the blue scale, that if you scale that back just a little bit, accounting for the difference in the XT and the regular 6600 model, you're not that far off with the GTX 1660. Still a very, very solid solution. World War Z is one of those games that you just take everything I said and you just throw it right out the window. Because obviously there's a lot more room the CPU has to give the GPU here. And I don't know what the limit here is. But a game like World War Z is GPU. It's going to be GPU intensive instead of CPU intensive. So the better GPU you have, the more performance or the better performance you're going to get. This is a case where you can say, if all I play is a game like this, then maybe go for that little bit extra on the GPU and worry about the CPU later. I don't know. There was a pretty noticeable difference here. A lot of room to give. The CPU had a lot of room for the GPU to make an improvement here. And then in Horizon Zero Dawn, pretty much the same thing. This game still is playable on 1080p low if you go with the RX 560. It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad card. But like I said, the price is coming down. It might be worth it, especially if you're looking for that magic 60 frames per second, to go with that mid option or the mid budget option, which in this case is that GTX 1660. And our AAA title finally is CSGO, or Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This will run on a paperclip, duct tape, and a rubber band. So you can pretty much run this on anything. Any potato will do it all. And you shouldn't be surprised to see that you get pretty decent performance out of this. There are some CPU and GPU combinations, or maybe integrated graphics, that are not going to hold up this very, very well. But even the RX 560 does great with this, with the i3. When you're talking about the upper two, or the middle and the upper end of your budget build, both of those are they'll turn out about the same. So again, we're starting to get CPU bound on here instead of GPU bound. And it doesn't matter how much better of a GPU we put in it, we're not going to get that much more than 350 frames per second or something like that. So we're going to eventually cap out no matter how high we go with that i3. So it makes just as good a sense to go with the middle price option as it would anything else. So what are my thoughts? My thoughts are, if you're building something right now, which is not unheard of, it's prices are coming down on GPUs, availability is getting better, used availability, new availability, CPUs and power supplies and memory and everything are pretty reasonably priced right now. And with availability, more people are going to go back into, hey, maybe it's time to go ahead and build that build. You can put a pretty decent computer together. You can get at least a budget computer going for between maybe $800 and $1,000. And if you buy some used parts or have some parts already that you're waiting on, you might be able to, now might be the time to go back and revisit that GPU and find a decent GPU for you. You're going to be able to find some decent options out there, especially if you leave yourself open to a few different things. If I had my druthers, what would I rather do? I would rather see if I couldn't afford something in that mid-range, that 1650 Super, that 1660, somewhere in that range. Solid GPUs. I just put a 1650 Super in a friend's build, and it's doing great. It does everything they needed to do, and the performance was wonderful. I mean, it was very solid. It did a great job. For that matter, the RX 560, that 4 gig, the one that's been in green on all these charts, it will do okay. It's not going to be a great AAA experience all the time, but if you lower the settings a little bit, you can play. Things are very playable, especially if you're holding out for the big one. Say you don't want to get the mid-range budget GPU, you'll get what you can get right now because you are saving up for an RTX 3070 or an RX 6800 or something like that. Maybe you're saving up for a better graphics card, so you're willing to budget right now and get a lower tier like an i3 or something CPU, and you're going to fit an RX 560, or you're going to fit, maybe if you can find it. I really wouldn't go with something like a GT 1030, but I mean, if you got to go with a low-end graphics card and just make something playable until you can afford it, who knows? Prices are going to keep coming down, at least for the foreseeable future. They're getting lower every day. The crypto is having issues. Difficulty on those is going up. I think things that as supply gets more, there's not going to be any choice but to have to lower the prices on some of these. Don't ever think at this point, with it going down, it's sort of like buying gas. If you go to the gas station and then tomorrow you see it 10 cents cheaper, don't beat yourself on the head. Remember how many gallons you got. Remember how much it actually comes out to this time at the pump. Now, if you're doing that every single day, yeah, it's going to make a big difference. But how often are you buying GPUs? So if you go out and you spend $250 on a GPU today and you find it for $240 tomorrow, don't beat yourself up about $10. The prices will eventually level back out. If you can wait that long, wait until you see that they might start, I don't know. I don't know if they're going to go back up or not. We don't have a clue. But right now they're trending down, so now might be the time to make an affordable buy. People are going to be making a lot more systems. They're going to be gaming more, I would think. It's finally getting to a point where a lot of this is starting to alleviate, and with gas prices shooting up, I don't want to mention something bad about that, but with gas prices going up, people might be traveling and driving around less, so they might be stuck at home, not really willingly, but might be stuck at home again. And what's the one thing that you can do when you're at home? Play with your computer. So anyway, I hope this is kind of like gives some kind of information. I'm sorry, it got rather weird and discombobulated. This had started out being comparing a couple of like budget options like CPUs and GPUs, and it's kind of gotten weird where I've had more information than I thought I was going to, so I've had to split this up over a couple of videos. And the next one, I think I'm going to be dealing with the older Dell that has the 4670 in it, comparing it to the i3. Now, I have to do some figuring around with that, including ordering a little bit more higher memory. I need to get 16 gig of memory, so it's apples to apples, because the old Dell has 8 and this has 16. But I'm curious to see if I get the same or better performance out of that RX 560 with more memory in the old Dell than I did with just the 8. So we'll have to see. But anyway, if you liked the video or found it helpful at all, or just entertaining, or just feel like it, throw me a like on it. I sure would appreciate it. It's been difficult in getting views, and I'll admit it's been. I'm not going to say it's been demotivating, but it hasn't been incredibly motivating when you look and you don't see a lot of views. So help me out. Throw a like on it. Give me a good comment. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Don't be afraid to hit me up on the other socials. I will catch back up with those soon. I promise. And until next time. I think the next one we're going to look at is we're going to revisit that Dell and compare it to this i3, Intel to Intel. So we're apples to apples. Anyway, that is all I have for right now, folks. So until next time, I'll see you later.